All right, this is going to be a review of Rob Van Dam, the complete ECW television title reign. This is a 7 DVD set from RF Video. This was actually also distributed by High Spots. That's where I got the set as well, about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So I'm finally getting around to reviewing this. Always wanted to talk about it because this is a spectacular set. It captures the complete television title reign. Pretty much everything that was defended on television is on this set. And to me, this is an example of taking a title that doesn't mean that much and elevating it to main event status. You know, there was a point where it was just as credible as the ECW world title. I think even Taz was frustrated at how over Van Dam and the television title had become. So this is, to me, this is an iconic title reign. I would say it really reminds me of Samoa Joe's ROH title reign in terms of taking a title that doesn't mean that much and elevating it to the point where it's the most important belt on the continent. So, and at the same time, you have to remember, I definitely wanted to bring this up. At that time, you know, the WWF title was changing hands like crazy. You know, that Vince Russo, if you guys might remember at that time, was booking WWF, and you know, there's just a lot of changes on television to get ratings, like The Rock and Mankind, and you had back and forth between Steve Austin and The Undertaker, so you had all that going on. Plus, I think the WCW title was constantly changing hands as well, from Flair to Hogan to Lex Luger to Goldberg to Nash. So you remember you had all these Monday Night War television ratings things going on, but the what made ECW different, I think Paul Heyman and Van Dam had the vision that we want to be different and we want to make this television championship stand out amongst all the belts in North America, and it really did. This was probably the best title reign of the Attitude Era, if you want to call the late 90s the Attitude Era. So, and I'm talking about all the major organizations in North America at that time. So this was amazing. So there's a ton of matches on here. I'm not going to rate every match. It's going to be tough to talk about every single match because there's almost about maybe 35 matches on this whole set. So I'm just going to talk about the most important points of the title reign. So the very first match, we get to Bam Bigelow, April 4th, 1998. At this time, Sabu and Rob Van Dam were tag team partners at the time, and Sabu gave Rob Van Dam strict orders just to soften up Bam Bigelow for Sabu, but that didn't happen here. Van Dam was on the verge of just breaking out and becoming his own star away from Sabu. He had stepped up his conditioning. He was just getting more and more over by the day. He was just so much more toned and in such better shape than he was at the barely legal pay-per-view. Van Dam was over, but he wasn't, he really hadn't captured, the entire audience when you look at some of the work he did in 1997. By the time you get to 1998, his fan base was just growing rapidly by the day. And after this match is over, I believe Paul Heyman told Van Dam, he said, it doesn't matter what you do when you go out there, they're going to go crazy for you no matter what, because this was such an epic performance against Bigelow that, everyone was just going crazy. This is the first time you heard loud, just really loud Rob Van Dam chants. He just busted out some amazing things. The two consecutive high spots that he did into the crowd, he just got such distance and such leap on those two spots, and he just had everyone going crazy. And there was actually a point in the match where Sabu came out to help Van Dam, but instead of softening up Bigelow, Van Dam actually went for the pinfall and got the roll up and actually won the television championship. And Sabu was kind of flabbergasted, like, what the hell did you just do? So this leads to a match between Rob Van Dam and Sabu at Wrestlepalooza '98, which was the very next pay-per-view. And this match right here, the television championship didn't get off to a very strong start. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure that Van Dam and Sabu had great chemistry as opponents. I think they were better off as a tag team. You know, they were the kind of tag team that was always fighting with each other. You know, Van Dam always acted like he was above Sabu, but Sabu always knew that he was really the leader of the team. So you had that whole thing going on. But the Sabu and Van Dam match from Wrestlepalooza in '98, this is an example of a match that just has not aged well over time. Some people have even told me that the match hadn't aged well, and I have to agree with them. Now, if you take some of the highlights of the match and edit it together without the botches, you'd be like, damn, this had a lot of great highlights. I mean, it was just way too long. There was a lot of awkward silence from the crowd. There was even parts in the match where the fans were booing Van Dam and Sabu for the botches. I mean, this was just like botch mania. You could put there was about maybe 3 or 4 big botches in this match where you could put on a botch mania highlight reel. I mean, I don't know, just not a lot of chemistry. This is the type of match that guys like Shawn Michaels and Triple H would just like laugh at. You know, they probably just wouldn't be a fan of this type of match. And this match kind of highlight some of the flaws that guys like Van Dam and Sabu would have had in the WWF, back in the day. But, I mean, Van Dam and Sabu, they did much better than this. They had a stretcher match back in 1996 that was a lot more brutal and just came off a little bit better than this. And they would even have matches down the road, specifically at Guilty as Charged 2000, that just flowed a lot better than this. But this was just not, this was just the worst match that they've had. I wouldn't even give this, over 2.5 stars. I just felt like, they just got off to a really sloppy start there. So, Van Dam's television title reign, it really started to pick up more steam once Jerry Lynn came into the equation. When you get to the end of the summer of 1998, Jerry Lynn stepped up, and you could finally see that someone could match Van Dam, hold for hold. Before this, you would put Van Dam in the ring with guys like Mikey Whipwreck, just other guys on the ECW roster that really couldn't keep up with Van Dam hold for hold. But Van Dam would still get a lot out of them, but not to the level where Jerry Lynn did. Jerry Lynn was able to match him like no one else did. And they just tore the house down at the ECW arena in Philadelphia. Van Dam got all bloody. I think he might have broke his nose here. But, you just saw that the potential that Van Dam and Jerry Lynn had. Even though this was just a taste of what they can do, it was still a historic milestone in Van Dam's television title reign. So really, the next big matchup here that I'll talk about is Lance Storm. I would say that besides Jerry Lynn, I would say Lance Storm was Van Dam's best opponent in ECW. They had a lot of matches on Hardcore TV and ECW on TNN. Lance Storm was just a great athlete. And, they have a lot of history that, going back to the first ECW pay-per-view, they actually wrestled on that show. What was the name of the first ECW pay-per-view? Barely Legal. So you see the whole thing with Van Dam acting like an asshole to Lance Storm. You had that whole controversy there with Van Dam being frustrated that he wasn't booked on the first pay-per-view. So you had all that tension boil down to Guilty as Charged 99. So when you get to Guilty as Charged 99, they hyped this matchup between Van Dam and Masato Tanaka. That was supposed to be like an international dream match, but the situation was Masato Tanaka couldn't get to the arena. I don't know if there was a snowstorm or something. Maybe something happened with his flight, but ended up being Lance Storm. And like I said, guys, like the chemistry between Van Dam and Lance Storm, I thought was great. I think these matches are really, really underrated. Lance Storm is a great athlete. There was even rumors that Lance Storm is on steroids. He actually cut a lot of promos about being juicing, being anti-steroids, because he was in such great shape that he had to always come out and, kind of deny it, even though there were so many rumors going on. I just think Lance Storm is really dedicated in the gym. So yeah, I mean, but bottom line is, Van Dam and Storm had a tremendous chemistry. I would say that the ECW Guilty as Charged 99 match was definitely Van Dam's most underrated match on pay-per-view, and one of the best finishing sequences I've seen in a Van Dam match. Just, Lance Storm's just going for a lot of power bombs here. Van Dam trying to counter the power bomb into a monkey flip, but then eventually he countered it into a German suplex to get the pinfall on Lance Storm. So just tremendous action here. You know, Lance Storm, like I said, just like Jerry Lynn, he was one of the few guys that could keep up with Van Dam, hold for hold. So definitely they had a lot of matches on this set, but I would say the ECW Guilty as Charged 99 match from January 99 was definitely the highlight of their matches together. So they started building up Jerry Lynn as, a threat to the television title reign. And, probably the best work that Van Dam and Jerry Lynn had done together was at Living Dangerously of March of 1999. This is when Van Dam really proved that he could, carry the company. I would say. And it got to the point where even if you weren't a fan of the ECW style, you had to recognize the Van Dam and Jerry Lynn matches in the same realm of Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair. It definitely had that type of, that type of series of matches where you were just, captivated. It just captivated you. I mean, the run that Van Dam and Jerry Lynn had was incredible. A lot of you guys probably already know it, but I would say that the Living Dangerously 99 match, it probably was their best work together. I mean, it really was. I mean, some of the spots here were just jaw-breaking. The chemistry was incredible here. There was even one sequence with Bill Alfonso. Now, when you watch this back, you have to put the sound really loud, though. But the sound really elevates this spot to the next level. Really, Bill Alfonso was, trying to hit Jerry Lynn with the chair, and then Jerry Lynn countered it, and then Van Dam tried to go for a spinning heel kick, and then Jerry ducks out of the way and actually drops a leg on Van Dam while the chair is on Van Dam's neck. That came off really, really great. There was actually a spot in the match where Van Dam actually kicks the chair to Jerry Lynn, and Jerry falls through the table. It just looked like Jerry took such a fall there. So that was a great spot. Just great chemistry. Just a lot of great counters off the top rope here. Actually went to a 20-minute time limit. This is when you got this is probably the best example of a crowd chanting 5 more minutes that I've ever seen. So Van Dam gets the victory here, but this is probably the most brutal work that they've done together. I remember the tornado DDT on the table onto the outside was, that might have been the sickest bump and most risky bump I've seen Van Dam ever take. So you have the Living Dangerously 99 match that leads up to a rematch at Hardcore Heaven. But before we get to there, Van Dam actually works with Too Cold Scorpio, CyberSlam 99. I would say that as far as Van Dam's popularity, it seemed to me like, in Philadelphia, they kind of, they weren't, one of the things about Philly, they ran in Philadelphia so often that whenever they came back to Philly, you kind of noticed that Van Dam's popularity wasn't as strong as it was in some of the other areas. Because, after you're accustomed to seeing, the Dragon Gate style or Rob Van Dam style, you kind of get used to it. So you don't treat the guy like he's such a god. So that's a little bit of a side. But you could definitely tell that Scorpio and Van Dam, that match from CyberSlam 99 wasn't as good as you would expect. You could tell Scorpio kind of, there was a little bit of regression compared to some of his work from 1996. So I'll talk about some of the more underrated matches from this set a little bit, but let's continue with the Jerry Lynn stuff. So you had the rematch with Jerry Lynn from Hardcore Heaven 99, pretty much just as good. I just thought it was a little bit more botchy. You could tell Jerry Lynn suffered a concussion on the one spot where Van Dam kicked him while he was hanging up on the top rope. He just had he seemed like he fell right on his head when he hit the mat there. But I mean that match actually had the sunset flip to the table. Just a lot of good stuff here, man. I mean, like I said, there was some botches. That's why probably people look at the Living Dangerously match like it's a little bit of a better match. But the Hardcore Heaven match, it got a little bit more attention. I believe Paul Heyman actually used this match as one of the first things that you saw when ECW got the TV deal on TNN. I think Heyman said, "Fuck it, I just want to show this match in its entirety." So you had that whole thing going on. Plus, I think this is the match that they put on the Pioneer DVDs when ECW got the DVD deal. This was the first match you've seen. So, the Hardcore Heaven match got a little bit more exposure than the Living Dangerously 99 match. But, still good stuff. You even saw Van Dam follow the code of honor here after the victory. So, yeah, man, the Van Dam and Jerry Lynn matches, they probably aren't 5 stars. when you watch these matches back and judge them just on the matches alone. But to me, I would give them 5 stars because of how revolutionary they were and for how groundbreaking they were at that time in 1999. And to me, they were just the best thing that from a wrestling standpoint, that you could have saw in North American wrestling at the time. Especially when you consider how what was going on with the Monday Night Wars. You know, the Monday Night Wars were a great time for WWF and WCW, but I'm just saying that wrestling just wasn't the main priority at the time. I think personalities and feuds and tension was more of the selling point than the actual wrestling. So I would just make that point. But from there, let me see what else we could talk about. So after that, Van Damme's next big opponent was probably, they went through this whole phase where after Van Damme and Jerry Lynn had these classic matches, they actually started teaming up together. And then, Van Damme had a lot of series of matches with Lance Storm and I think Just Incredible as well. So they were more of a tag team at that time. And it wasn't, Van Damme did some good work with the Dudleys. He actually wrestled all the Dudleys, even Spike Dudley, Devon, and Bubba Ray. Really good stuff from them. Even Spike Dudley did a great job of, making Van Damme look good, as well as Mikey Whipwreck. So you have Van Damme having matches with these, guys like that could really, even though they're not, known as great wrestlers, they really added a lot to the television title reign. But the one guy that actually, Van Damme had I would say that this was probably Van Damme's first main event on pay-per-view. When you get to Anarchy Rules, September 99, was actually Balls Mahoney. I think this is the first time Van Damme got the actual last match main event at a pay-per-view. I think the reason why Van Damme and Balls Mahoney had, the Anarchy Rules match was great. They had other good matches as well. But with Balls Mahoney, kind of out of shape, really heavy, maybe 350 pounds, greasy hair, it's such a thin line. I'll tell you, because, I had a friend that actually went to an ECW show, and he actually said he saw Balls Mahoney's mother dropping him off to wrestle him so he could wrestle at the show. So that just shows you how thin of a line it is between being a guy like Balls Mahoney and then being a guy like Triple H. But just interesting to look at that dynamic right there. But I think the reason why Balls Mahoney and Van Damme had such good matches, you could tell Balls Mahoney is a fan. Just from watching the interviews, he seems like a really cool guy. He's into cool things. I think there was even a flaming table spot he did with the Dudleys, where the Dudleys power bombed them through a flaming table. He said, I don't give a shit what happens. This is going to be the coolest thing that you've ever seen on television. And, you could just tell he was a fan of Van Damme's style, and he was able to, for his size, he was able to kind of match Van Damme and actually do some cool things, some athletic things that you wouldn't expect a guy that big to do. And, like I said, the Anarchy Rules match against Balls Mahoney, that was actually Van Damme's first. I think that was his first pay-per-view main event, so that was huge for Van Damme, and the match definitely delivered. That's kind of an example of a match right there where Van Damme could just take a guy that's really not that established, and he could still go out there and have a kick-ass match with. So that's what kind of made this television title reign seem great. Like, no matter who Van Damme was in the ring with, not every match was going to be the Jerry Lynn 5-star match, but every match was pretty cool and different too. Like Van Damme's style was just so different at the time. The way he kind of incorporated technical wrestling, because he was still a good wrestler. He was able to, probably better than anybody, he was able to incorporate technical wrestling and hardcore stuff probably better than anybody, and athleticism as well. Van Damme was just such a great athlete. You could even argue that Van Damme was, because Shawn Michaels had retired in 1999. When you look at 1999, Van Damme probably was the best wrestler in the United States, and Bret Hart was kind of on the decline at the time because of the booking. You could probably argue that Van Damme was above Benoit in WCW. I don't think WCW really utilized Benoit to their full potential. From that standpoint, you could crown Van Dam the best wrestler in the United States in 1999. You remember Jericho was kind of transitioning, so he really wasn't full time in 1999. So, and then Eddie kind of had a bad year because of the car accident in '99. So yeah, Van Dam, 1999 was definitely his year, without a doubt. It probably was the best year of his career in terms of the overall body of work. So after the Balls Mahoney match, at that same pay-per-view, Anarchy Rules 1999, Taz, the word got out that Taz was leaving to go to the WWF. So that's probably one of the reasons why Van Dam got the main event that night. They took the title off of Taz and put it on Mike Awesome, I believe. So, this is one of the things I hate about pro wrestling. I hate it when a guy is leaving, and then when a guy is leaving, it's just so predictable that, they're going to put over, whatever talent is left on the roster. To me, like, if you're going to leave, just leave. I really kind of lose passion for wrestling when I know that the guy is going to put someone over just because he's leaving. That's one of the things that I don't like about The Rock. I mean, The Rock is great, and The Rock is an icon. He was so good that, it really was depressing when you think about how many times The Rock was going to drop the belt because you knew he was going to go make a movie, or you knew this was his last match. I mean, the Rock, putting someone over because he was leaving and dropping the belt to someone because he was leaving, it just happened so many times that really that might be the thing that probably killed my passion for wrestling more than anything. It happened against Austin, happened against Brock, it happened against Goldberg. There's just so many times when that happened. And that right there, that situation right there when a guy's leaving and, he's going to put the guy over, that right there is probably the thing I like the least about pro wrestling. So, Van Dam and Taz, this could have been a monumental matchup for ECW. I would say that two of the things that hurt ECW, one was Van Dam getting hurt. So Van Dam never officially lost the television championship, which I'll talk about later. And then Taz getting stripped of the ECW championship because he was going to the WWF. I thought those two things really hurt ECW because I think down the road, you could have done a unification match in the summer of 2000. That would have been huge business for ECW. I mean, still, when you look at 2000, even though ECW went bankrupt later on that year, by the time you get to the first couple days of 2001, the first week of 2001 to be exact, ECW was still doing great business in 2000. There was even rumors, or maybe it's even facts. You could go back and look up the pay-per-view buy rates. Some of them were actually beating WCW. I'm not so sure how true it is. I know Paul Heyman said that in a documentary, but they probably weren't far behind, because when you look at some of the houses that Van Dam and, Taz and all these guys were drawing, late 99 going into 2000, I mean, they really felt like mainstream wrestling crowds, to be completely honest with you. But it speaks to how hot the business was in 99 and 2000. But, the Van Dam and Taz match, it was cool. I wouldn't say it was great. You had that one awesome spot where, Taz countered the spinning heel kick into a Tazplex through the table. That was really cool. But, when Van Dam pinned Taz, to me, it just wasn't that believable. And, all Taz did was, put Rob Van Dam over before he went on his way out. But, Van Dam, the whole thing between Van Dam and Taz, it just, I don't know, Taz's whole atmosphere and mood here, it really felt like he just kind of wanted to get out of the company. So the Van Dam and Taz match could have been a lot more effective, could have been bigger, if both guys were under contract and both guys were really, the agenda was to elevate ECW as a company. I'll just say that. So, Van Dam had good matches with Little Guido. And then by the time you get to this portion, late 99 going into 2000, this is when they pulled the trigger with Sabu and Van Dam. So at this point, Van Dam elevated himself past Sabu. And, Sabu and Van Dam, there was always tension there, but at this time it was at an all-time high. And they had a couple of, really good matches on television. Then there was a match with Sabu where it actually went to a time limit draw, and the crowd kept asking for 5 more minutes. And then Van Dam started cutting some of the best heel promos of his career here. I mean, he really shot on Sabu for real. Talked about how, you know, Sabu was the Sheik's second favorite wrestler, which is a huge shot, because the Sheik was like a god to Sabu. You know, the Sabu dedicated his whole wrestling career to the Sheik. And, you know, for Van Dam to take a cheap shot at Sabu like that was very disrespectful. But I'm sure Paul Heyman, you know, that was just good writing by Paul Heyman, because it felt really real. And like I said, guys, they did a good job here of getting Sabu more more over than Van Dam. You know, there is actually some parts where, you know, Heyman did a good job. Whoever booked this did a good job to get Van Dam hated. This is the first time you could actually feel the crowd wanting to see Van Dam lose the television championship. And this was all building towards a match at Guilty as Charged 2000, where, to me, this is the best work Van Dam and Sabu did together. To me, they had a red-hot crowd. The match flowed a lot better. All the hardcore spots just came off really well. There wasn't that awkward silence of botching that you saw at the match 2 years earlier. So, yeah, so Van Dam and Sabu, good stuff there. Also, you had a good storyline there with Bill Alfonso, you know, Van Dam's manager, also Sabu's manager, kind of like playing peacemaker. You know, he was kind of in the middle of both of them. And, you know, Van Dam chose the television title reign over their friendship. And, you know, he did the Van Daminator to Bill Alfonso, and then he put Sabu away as well. So that really elevated Van Dam past Sabu, I would say. And it's crazy because Sabu, at one point, he really was the most over guy in ECW history, but I think Van Dam really eclipsed him when you get to, you know, 1999. All right, so before the set ends, the very last match Van Dam had was against Masato Tanaka on Hardcore TV. So this is like an international dream match. This is really cool because Tanaka was really, you know, he could take a lot of punishment, as you saw in the matches between Mike Awesome and Masato Tanaka. You guys remember from ECW One Night Stand, November to Remember 1999. They just had these crazy matches where they could just take a lot of punishment with chairs. So Van Dam knew how to use the chair better than anybody. So, yeah, I mean, I would say the match was cool. It was good. You know, they did a lot of creative stuff with the chairs here, and, you know, the Van Daminator came off great. You know, Tanaka did a lot of great counters to Van Dam's offense. So, yeah, you know, the Van Dam and Tanaka match, it was only on television. It wasn't the pay-per-view extravaganza that they envisioned for Guilty as Charged 99, but, you know, it was still good. And then Van Dam actually breaks his ankle. They don't show the match against Rhino here, but maybe it was at a house show. Maybe it was at another television taping. Maybe it didn't make it onto TV. Van Dam actually goes for a baseball slide, and he breaks his ankle against Rhino. So he was forced to vacate the television title reign. So Van Dam makes it about 23 months with the television championship, and then is taken away from him by Cyrus the Virus. That was probably one of the most emotional Van Dam promos. Basically tells Cyrus, you know, good luck with the network, about finding someone that could set the standard that I've set with the television title reign. So, and then Van Dam even talked about how ECW, you know, has come so far, and, you know, and we're not going to go back to doing house shows, because there's this whole storyline where Cyrus wanted to censor ECW because of this whole thing with the networks not wanting them to you know, do all the raunchy stuff on television. But, you know, that's kind of how that promo went. But yeah, man, this is an incredible television championship reign. I really think this is one of the best reigns in the history of the business. I think it's right up there with Joe's reign, Danielson's reign, you know, Shawn Michaels' reign from '96. One of the things I wanted to touch on, though, is watching some of this stuff back, I'm a little bit worried about Van Dam, the person. You know, not to the degree of Chris Benoit. I would say that Benoit probably had the worst case of CTE than anyone in the history, yeah, by far the history of the business. But I'll go a step further. I think Benoit had the worst case of CTE more so than anyone ever. I mean, because he's someone that used his head as a weapon. You have to think about that. I know a lot of these guys in the NFL, the helmet-to-helmet collisions, a lot of those guys have CTE. A lot of boxers have CTE. My stepmother's cousin just got I didn't even know this, but you could actually test for CTE now. He's actually a boxer and came back negative. So you can get tested for CTE. If someone, some way could share this video with Rob, it'd be great if he could get tested for CTE, because I like to see Van Dam have a nice long life. He's one of my favorite people and wrestlers in pro wrestling history. So hopefully he's just taking care of himself. And he even said that when Eddie died, all Eddie had to do was get a CAT scan, and that could have prevented him from dying. So that was kind of a wake-up call for Van Dam. So I'm sure he does take care of himself. But, yeah, I mean, looking back on it, he just took a lot of unprotected chair shots to the head. So I just hope he doesn't develop any sort of brain damage from all this stuff, because he did take a lot of abuse. A lot of these guys in ECW did, probably even more so than a lot of the other guys. But, you know, if Mick Foley's still walking around and okay, I'm sure, you know, there's a good chance Van Dam will be okay. But seriously, it's I just think, you know, all these guys need to get tested. It's just a serious thing. But that's pretty much it, guys. Van Dam was one of a kind, just like the song says. You know, he was really unlike anybody. But looking back on it, you're going to put him on the same show with Triple H and Shawn Michaels on Raw. Looking back on it, I just don't think he stood a chance. He really did it. He really didn't. You know, there was a lot of guys that just weren't a fan of that ECW style. And I talk about this time and time again, but, you know, him and Shawn Michaels should have worked more together. But no, there was just a lot of guys. Even Stone Cold admitted that he just, you know, felt a little bit awkward working with Van Dam because of the style. But you know, that's what made Van Dam different, though. You know, he didn't really want to adapt to the WWE style. He really didn't adapt to it at all. And it kind of hurt him in the end. But, you know, he still had a successful run. You know, he was probably the most over guy during the Invasion. Without a doubt, could have been world champion on Raw. You know, he really should have been the man. You know, there's a lot of people saying that it would have been too soon for Van Dam to win it at No Mercy 2001. But, you know, I thought that would have been, looking back on it, I think Van Dam should have been, you know, main event of WrestleMania 18. You know, I think probably, you know, would have been the most over guy had they done it right. That was just such a tough time because you had, you know, so much star power there. There was just, looking back on it, he just had no shot of, you know, getting that spot. And, you know, it always seemed like someone would kind of upstage Van Dam at that time. You know, there was always some sort of a return, like Triple H for WrestleMania 18, or there was always some, you know, rookie coming in, like Brock Lesnar for SummerSlam 2002. And, you know, Shawn Michaels at Survivor Series 2002, the Elimination Chamber, that would have been a good time to give Van Dam the belt. So I always think, you know, the mid 2002, end of 2002, that should have been Van Dam's time. The turning point was that Elimination Chamber match, and I've talked about it time and time again. But you could just see Van Dam was never going to get back in that spot. And when they sent him to WWF New York for Armageddon 2002, you just knew something wasn't right, because I thought that should have been a triple threat with Van Dam in the mix as well, with Triple H and Shawn Michaels at Armageddon 2002. And I don't know, looking back on it, I just don't like the I don't know, the whole thing with Triple H and Shawn just kind of passing the belts back with each other. It just seemed like the wrong thing. I think Van Dam really could have been the guy, you know, to replace Rock and Austin. I just remember he was just so over and so different at the time. But, you know, the problem is that the performer has to want it as well. And I just feel like Van Dam really didn't want to become the guy that they wanted him to become. And I think that kind of held him back as well. But even WrestleMania 19, I thought that would have been a cool thing as well. But eventually he did have his moment at ECW One Night Stand 2006 against Cena, which is a really cool moment. I always thought it would have been cool to have Triple H in that spot as well at the Hammerstein Ballroom. But because that was kind of like at the apex of all the Cena hate, I think Van Dam and Cena, I thought that worked out very well. But, you know, even that whole thing with bringing back ECW didn't work. You know, there's a lot of regret about Van Dam's run into the WWE. Obviously, it could have been a lot better, but, you know, He's fine for what he was, for what it was, but he'll always be remembered for being the ECW television champion and really being the one that turned away the bigger contracts from WWF and WCW and, you know, fought for what he believed in. And what he believed in was ECW as a brand, the ECW style. You know, Van Dam is ECW, and he did it for as long as he could. And it's a shame that he got hurt and couldn't end this television title reign, but looking back on it, the television title reign, to me, it was one of the most iconic title reigns in the history of the business. So here we go. And that's pretty much it, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. And I'll see you later for the next one. All right.